The final element, and I don't need to dwell on this for too long, is on page 6. Okay, and there's a number of bullet points there. You can see at the top of the page, I'd highlight that title there, How to Read Any Poem. This is a final little thing that we look at in terms of when we're dissecting both studied and unseen poetry. Okay, you can see, I'll go from the bottom up, you can see the bullet points there. Think why the poet has elected to use these techniques as discussed. Rhythm, beat, rhyming schemes, imagery as discussed, figurative language there, metaphors and similes. If you want to jot that term down, figurative language, great term to use. Imagery, tone, punctuation. Beside punctuation, guys, we might jot down this term, which is enjambment. It's not mutually exclusive with regards to punctuation and a lack of punctuation, but again, typically they go hand in hand a lot of the time. Punctuation, very important, full stops, really kind of slow things down, stop, really put emphasis on things as well. Exclamation points gives a good sense of poetic persona or the voice of the poet. Enjambment, on the other hand, guys, is when you get run-on lines. Okay, when one line runs on to the next, it gives it pace, it gives speed to the poetry as well. All right, so it's very, very important to note. Vocab, as we said, vocab choice, structure and shape. We discussed conventional, unconventional, all very important. One element I do want to pause on, because I haven't really mentioned it massively today, is on page 6 is the title. Okay, I did tell you already 8 to 10 reference points is what you need to take from individual poems. One of them, guys, has to be the title. Okay, not just for Dickinson, because again, Dickinson's poetry was produced posthumously, not a P's there, but her work was published after her death. That's why the poems that we look at all have the title as the opening line, because they don't actually have a title. And that's a question that's interesting as well in terms of why do poems rather have the same title as the opening line. For your own heads, it's typically that either they never intended them to be published, that they sent to other poets as letters and kind of in correspondence, or the fact that they died before the poems were actually published. And that's the case in Dickinson's case here as well. But the title, guys, becomes one of our 8 to 10 reference points, because you ask yourself, what are the connotations associated with the title? Now, if you've never heard of this word before, again, it's a great piece of vocab. Connotations, guys, is when you read one word, you immediately think of 2 or 3 other words, okay? Hope is the thing with feathers, for example. You immediately think of, well, the thing with feathers, or we're thinking about a bird, for example. We're thinking about the concept of hope. What are the connotations associated? I always kind of joke with the classes, when you think of, say, McDonald's, for example, the connotations are maybe like, 12-pack of chicken nuggets or broken ice cream machine. Like, those are the connotations that you think of when you think of McDonald's, say, for example, all right? But the title, very important that you ask yourself, well, what is being produced here when I think about this? And ask yourself, I always think this is a great thing for students to take on board, because it looks really good at the beginning of an answer to say, that you were shocked by the stark juxtaposition between title and content. You think about a poem, say for example, that has a really positive, jovial, upbeat title, and then the body of the text is depressing and it's harrowing and it's upsetting. Well, then you'd say that there's a real stark juxtaposition between title and content. That's just a couple of reasons why the titles are so important going forward. Final thing on this is the top of page 6. Make sure that when you're going through your poetry, you ask yourself a couple of questions. Ask yourself, first off, who is talking? All right, we already have in the back of our mind now the concept of extended metaphor, and we make sure that we're thinking about this. Is this potentially an extended metaphor, for example? Who is talking? The voice, for example, is it the poet? And if it's the poet, then it's confessional, okay? It's a confessional poem. Is it a character, for example? And then if it's a character, for example, we call it poetic persona. And then if it's an object, we obviously know this and we classify that as personification. That's very important. As I said, very important to do it early on as well. What are they talking about, guys, is subject matter. That's not the theme. The next element here is the theme, is the message of the poem. So if you're to write down beside it there, the thematic approach. I always think that's a really nice little line to use. Thematic approach of the poet in this poem, in this particular poem. Final bullet point, guys, I'd ask you to write down yourself there, which is how. How are they putting it across? It's the fourth kind of thing that we look at. How is the poet saying it? So what's the tone of the poem? Is it upbeat, positive, jovial, optimistic? Or is it much more kind of dark, as I said, visceral, ominous, foreshadowing, etc., etc.? Okay? So that's page 6. Very important when we're dissecting our poetry in terms of how to dissect our poems as well. All right? Again, you can see in terms of page 7, 8, 9. These are a couple of examples in terms of revision process, in terms of if you were to look at, I suppose, if you were to look at revising this, you know, we're going through this in the 70, 75 minutes of today's class, but in a couple of weeks' time, say for example, if you're like, you go back to the notes and you ask yourself, right, how much of Gavin's class can I remember? How much of that pattern, imagery, sensuousness and suggestiveness that he went through with me can I remember actually now? All right, so that might be a little bit of a revision process. What you have, guys, on page 10 of the notes there, I'll pause on this for a second, just to wrap up the unseen poetry. We have a couple of things to do just to wrap it up. We now have, I would argue, an ability to dissect any unseen poem, any studied poem as well. So we now have an ability to dissect the poetry, okay? What do we need to expect when we look at an unseen poem? You can have an example on page 10 here. This is a perfect example of what an unseen poem might look like. 2015, we have our title, Peter Street. What I would say to you before I get lost in a tangent, put a little star beside that there, Peter Street. A side note, okay, this is what I've looked at over the 12 years of teaching Leaving Cert English, is that a lot of the time the unseen poem tends to be focused on a location. And guys, if that's the case, it's going to be incredibly sensuous, it's going to be incredibly visual, because the poet needs to create the world that we're experiencing, okay? So it tends to use a lot of descriptive language, a lot of sensuous language. I'd ask you to drop that down there beside Peter Street just as an example, okay? Then what you do is you highlight your title, that's done there, then you jump to the questions. And we'll talk about the questions for a second here, and I'll direct you over to this board, and then we'll have a little look at timing, okay? Guys, typically what we see is, in an unseen task, is you have 1A and 1B, all right? These are each 10 marks, okay? And effectively what you're going to try and write is about maybe 3/4 of an A4 page, probably 2 solid paragraphs within it. Each 5-mark paragraph you'll have to reference maybe twice, so 2 different quotes in each 5-mark paragraph, okay? Again, I know I'm flying through that structure. We do have a very finite amount of time to spend together today. Something that we work on a lot within the grinds. You know, we arguably spend about 2 different 75-minute classes on our unseen poetry, really going through a huge amount of exemplar material, sample answers, really getting into the bones of the structure. Here, I know it's an overview, but again, it's a good place to start. About 3/4 of an A4 page, 3/4 of an A4 page, 2 paragraphs each, and as I said, within each paragraph, maybe the poem referenced twice, okay? Typically, okay, guys, typically, these questions, now it changes up, but typically, question 1A is about imagery, it might be question 1B, but one of these questions is about imagery, and the other question then is about the theme, maybe the poet himself, maybe about the subject matter, what's being basically discussed within the poem, okay? Sometimes they reflect one another, as in comment on 2 images within the poem that highlight the theme, and then again you go into it and you have to reference then similar, if not the same, images again, okay? Or question 2, which is the full 20 marks, full 5%. Typically, guys, this is a style-based question. And what you are, I suppose, required to do within this one here is you're required to draw heavily from the techniques and the technical aspects that you found. Effectively, guys, that's your PISS. That is why I encourage my day school students and grind school students to look to the 20-mark question, establish, is it a style-based question? So you'll get asked, you'll get the word style in there, you'll get aesthetic language, you'll get the word language by itself, okay? That's the type of question that I tell my students to gravitate towards, because effectively what you're doing is you're coming up with 3 or 4 points within that are largely based on pattern, imagery and sensuousness, okay? So that's one thing that I would gravitate towards. That's kind of a typical example of what your questions will be asking you and what you're required to do within each one. The final element that you guys need to be very, very aware of when it comes to unseen poetry is timing and time management. As a gentle rule of thumb, guys, for your paper 2 material, it's about a minute per mark. So if you look at 60 minutes, say for your Shakespearean text, 60 minutes equals 60 marks, because that's obviously 60 marks. 70 marks for your comparative, you tend to spend about 70 minutes on that. And in the same way here, with your unseen poetry, this is kind of almost the only outlier that you're going to spend maybe 22 minutes for a 20-mark question, okay? 25 minutes I have here, absolute max. You don't need to send in more than 25 minutes, because then what happens is you're going to take time away from other areas where you actually need to implement that time, okay? What I would say is, guys, leave this till last. So everything we've discussed today in terms of our unseen poetry, you're going to leave that till last. It's the last thing a lot of us will do with regards to English, and should be in terms of the Leaving Cert, okay? You have 22 to 25 minutes max to take on this task. You're going to try and produce about 2 A4 pages of material. Again, you look back here, if those are 3/4 of a page each, you know, you're looking at an A4 page and a half, A4 page and 3/4. And again, same way here, A4 page and 3/4 to 2 A4 pages. You have about 4 minutes to dissect the questions and then the poem. And I'm doing that there in terms of a chronological aspect, what you should do first. Dissect the questions first and then the poem itself within that 6 minutes, because there's no point in reading the poem a couple of times and then getting onto the questions and then going, oh, well, what are they actually asking for from me here, all right? Make sure you know what the questions are looking for first, then you take on the poem, and then it's 8 to 10 minutes per A4 page. For a lot of us right now, in terms of fifth year, it's going to be 10 to 12 minutes to try and produce an A4 page. That's absolutely fine as it stands now. But as we go on, we're going to get a little bit faster, and we're going to try and get down towards the 10 to 8 minutes window as well, okay? One thing I have written here, guys, it's something that I really feel that you should adopt now in terms of fifth year, before, you know, you get into bad habits, is our planning, all right? There are 5 areas of your English Leaving Cert that deserve a plan. They are your question B question on paper 1, your essay question, section 2, composition on paper 1 as well, your single text Shakespeare, your comparative, and your studied poetry, all right? Those are 5 areas that you have to plan, all right? It's not down in the marking scheme in terms of black and white, but it is there. It's alluded to that students who do produce plans tend to fare a lot better than students who don't. The reason why I have plan written down there for our unseen poetry as well is because it's a great way, if you have 30 to 60 seconds to spare, you jot down some of the techniques that you found, some of the elements in terms of even your paragraphing for your cohesion mark, go through the roof. It's just a great way for an examiner to understand, yeah, this person knows exactly what they're supposed to be doing here when they're taking on this task. All right, so that's just something worth looking at as well there. Guys, I will leave page 10 there in Peter Street to you guys. Have a little dissection of that yourself. You can see very briefly 1A there, what's the message of the poem. As I said, that's a thematic element. 1B there, 2 images. Again, that's the imagery element I said to you there as well. And then identify emotions expressed by the poet and explain how these emotions are conveyed in the poem. And that's a stylistic element. You're looking at the mood, you're looking at emotions, and ultimately how do we get to happiness and sadness? Well, us, for an understanding element, will be taking the technical aspects in terms of aesthetic language there as well. All right, so again, it's a random year, 2015. It's just backed up what I've just said there about the potential types of questions you're likely to experience. Okay? So guys, on that, that's our unseen poetry. So before we spend the next kind of 10 to 15 minutes looking at our studied poetry, let's just have a brief, kind of look back in terms of where we're at now, all right? In terms of taking on an unseen poem, we have our timing, we have the potential predicted questions, we understand we need to dissect the questions and understand exactly the LOQ, what is the language of the question, what are they specifically looking for from me within this question, and how do I regurgitate that, how do I respond to that, okay? And more importantly than all of that, you understand how to dissect a poem as well, all right? So that's a very, very good start. It's definitely not all the way, but I would argue that for those of us who are a little bit of conscientious individuals watching the video today, you're very far away down the line there in terms of getting that 5%, getting those 20 marks, all right? If we push on in terms of our studied poet and our studied poetry, you can have a little look in terms of how our kind of notes work a little bit here. I will just say that these are a microcosm of not only the unseen poetry, but also the Emily Dickinson notes themselves. These are a microcosm. These are effectively the free version. And then again in the grinds, we have much more bolstered. Again, there's far more sample answers, much more exemplar material, and a little bit more dissection as well. All right. Nonetheless, in terms of page 11, you can see there what we're looking out for in Dickinson's poetry. That's something that you guys will have a little look at yourself. On page 12, we're going to change a couple of things here. The timing, as I said there, 50 minutes. It's a 50-mark question. 50 minutes is what we're going to look at in terms of our time management. Approximately 4 pages. We're going to write 6. We're going to try and go minimum 4 if you want to write this down, maximum 6. Okay, we are going to try, where it says here quotes and reference at least 4 of her poems. We want to change that now as well, and what we're going to do is we're going to try and reference 6 of her poems. Okay, because of what's down in the department marking scheme, it tells us that a representative selection will typically come from 6 poems of the poet's work. So make sure that, guys, we're quoting and we're referencing from 6 poems. A side note on that, there are 2 ways to go about writing a studied poetry question. Okay, the first thing to note is that there are always 2 parts to every studied Leaving Cert poetry question. They will invariably look at style elements and some element then of SM, stands for subject matter there, some element of a thematic approach, something to do with the poet themselves. Okay, maybe some intense emotion, for example, within her work, etc., etc. But those are the 2 parts that we need to focus on, all right? And as I was mentioning there are 2 ways that we can go about this. We can go about it poem by poem, which again, obviously I know we're only starting 50 year, so I suppose a Leaving Cert poetry essay might be a little bit beyond us at the minute. But you can go poem by poem and you can deal with your 6 poems reflecting the 2 parts of the question. Here's the first poem, how it deals with the question. Done, box it off. Next one, do that 6 times. That's fine. It's fine for 5th year, I would argue. The much better way to go about it would be what's described as point by point. And in a point by point essay, what you effectively have is you have about 3 what's called areas of focus. There's AOF there, guys. You have about 3 areas of focus, and what that allows you to do is link your poems together. All right, and again, we'll have a little look in terms of some of the poems that you guys might look at with regards to Dickinson and how we might link those poems together. Point by point, guys, I would encourage you guys massively to look at it that way. I have a sample answer in terms of Dickinson, including in the notes there, that you could have a little look at. And again, what that is actually, that's a mix between the 2. So ask yourself, identify the reason why it's a mix between the 2, guys. Just a side note, is it's a teaching aid. It's something that I would use in the grinds to show you the difference between poem by poem, and point by point. So just be mindful of that when you are looking at it. On page 13, some of the poems on our syllabus, some of the poems that we effectively look at here. We look at Hope is the Thing with Feathers. I would highlight that one. Certain Slant of Light, I would highlight. Felt a Funeral in My Brain. I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died. The Soul Has Bandaged Moments. And I Taste the Liquor Never Brewed. Those are typically the 6 poems that we look at. The reason being is because of these areas of focus. Okay, the poems find themselves very easy to link with one another. All right. For example, I Felt a Funeral in My Brain and I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died are 2 incredibly dark, depressing poems. Really highlight Dickinson struggling with her mental health and the idea of agoraphobia, that she really struggled to even leave her room for extended periods of time. So that's an example of one of the areas of focus that you might use. Okay. To show you just how the notes work, first of all, and just have a little overview of the notes rather than dissecting a poem, we'll have a little look at one. We'll probably come back to page 14 to have a little look at one. But if you have a look at the poems that are mentioned there, guys, look at there's the dissection there for you at the end of each individual poem. Okay, we have a little bit of an insight into her poetic voice there at the start, what we're looking out for within her poetry. If you have a little look in terms of page 30 of the notes, we have sample answers. And again, a little bit of a biography and some, I suppose, bullet points that are to be used there with regards to Dickinson herself. What I would encourage you guys to do is when you are going through Dickinson, either in the notes yourself or whether you're going through it in the day school, is have a little look at the volume of information that I've included there at the end of each individual note. That information is for you. It's for you to lift and take and amalgamate into your own essays, all right? It's to help with interpretation, but you'll see hopefully that there's some nice little one-liners there as well that you can just lift yourself and totally use yourself, okay? So that's what I would say with regards to those poems. If you have a little look, just as an example of that, on page 14, top of the page there, Hope is the Thing with Feathers. You remind yourself that you dissect the title every single time. Hopefully even now, and the very short amount of time that we spent together, you'll be able to identify that it's a very conventionally structured poem in terms of the fact that again, it's 3 stanzas, 4 lines per stanza. However, once you read it yourselves, the content is deeply unconventional. You have very much a literal to the abstract poem there. Again, it's the literal bird, this tiny little bird, hope is the thing with feathers, and it's being used to, I suppose, discuss or highlight the concept of hope. All right? If you have a look, just take 1 or 2 stanzas maybe. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. Little things that we'll have to take from that is the repetition of and, for example, the punctuation that's used there, and sings the tune without the words. A song that has no words in it highlights the fact that it's universal, that everybody can access it, it appeals to everyone, and never stops at all. And you have that hyperbole as well that only works with the extended metaphor that is kind of the concept of the bird being hope. Okay, so there's a couple of things. Obviously, that's again a complete overview of how we dissect one of these stanzas. Again, arguably, as I said, in terms of how the grinds work, we tend to spend about 2 75-minute classes on one poet. We have an overview of the poet, an overview of their style. We look at 3 poems within that class. And then in the next week, then we go through the other 3 poems, we go through the exemplar material, and we really then cement, again, potential questions that might come up, and then we start to look at how we construct these essays as well that are going to get us significant marks as well. Have a little look, as I said, at the bottom of page 14 there. You can see the little bullet points that we've used. I've also included within the Dickinson notes, because as I said, one of the more complex, one of the more difficult poets, as I said at the very beginning of today's class, how do we simplify things? How do we make things a lot easier for you as candidates, you as students? We've gone through the techniques there. We've given you just a volume of information at the end of each individual Dickinson poem that they're there for you guys, I suppose, to clarify, I suppose, what I would say is more convoluted, more difficult poems. All right, guys, there are 6 or 7 poems mentioned there within the actual handout themselves. The majority of them are fully dissected within an inch of their life. Again, we go through every facet of detail, every technique. In the grinds themselves, we go through them, again, collectively together. We dissect them. We look for, again, we're obviously up against it time-wise today, but what we do is we look for things that aren't universally expressed by other day school teachers, aren't often spoken about, and we look for, again, the background to the poems, the things that the poet has said about the poem themselves, which allows you to talk about it in the correct context. It's massive if you have an ability to say in an answer that what Dickinson has said of this poem herself was X. Little things like that. A lot of it is, again, contained within the biography at the back of the notes there as well, that there is that information that you can draw from and that you can take yourself as well. All right. So guys, if we have a look, just to finish off today's class in terms of all the things that we've looked at, again, that's a tiny introduction to Dickinson. What I would say is that the notes are more so there for you to use, and again, have a little look at the pattern, imagery, sensuousness and suggestiveness. Take on a lot of those poems. Again, obviously not now, but certainly when you start back in September, take on the poems themselves. Dissect them under those 4 headings: pattern, imagery, sensuousness and suggestiveness. Why we ask ourselves a why again is because that is what the examiners are looking for. They're looking for that terminology. They're looking for your understanding of those technical aspects within the poet's work. So you would be crazy not to regurgitate, not to, I suppose, use those as your headings, as your focal points within it. Okay? If we look back in terms of the plan for today, 17.5%, again, we now have the tools to take on both unseen and studied poetry. Unseen poetry predominantly is we're on the cusp of just about finishing that, even in this very much finite short amount of time that we've looked at, I suppose, that we've spent together. But we're on the cusp of finishing that. We need a little bit more on structure and a little bit, I suppose, in terms of exemplar material. But other than that, we're thereabouts. And we now have the ability to really attack the 12.5% of our studied poets and all the studied poets that we will look at over the course of 5th and 6th year. Okay, guys, my name is Gavin again. I hope you found today useful again, and I hope to see a number of you guys in a classroom full of students as opposed to the one-to-one, I suppose, camera here that we've on the go. All right, thanks guys, I'll see you soon.